If
The
he
energy
guessed what
readings
she
are
was
still
afraid of,
fluctuating,
she would
even after the
apologize to him in front of
recalibration.
everyone.
Then we have to move forward
Celeste
with the
Hawthorne
secondary
said
plan
it as if she
immediately.
were
We
signing
can't
a
afford any
contract.
delays.
Clean,
Right away.
effortless,
It's all right.
final. The words left her mouth with the same cool
We're gonna figure this
confidence
out.
she
I'm right
used
here
to
with you.
approve layoffs, acquisitions, and the fate of people whose names she would never truly learn. The conference room on the 42nd floor was made of glass that pretended to be invisible. It held the city like a reflection and turned sunsets into trophies. Below, traffic crawled along in ribboned arteries. Above, the last light of day leaned into the windows like an exhausted witness. Around the table sat the people who rarely blinked when money moved. Richard Hawthorne, chairman, her uncle, her father's brother, rested his hands on a leather folder as if he were keeping something caged. Two board members watched Celeste the way sailors watched weather. A legal counsel typed notes with a quiet efficiency that bordered on devotion. Celeste's assistant Jennifer stood near the door, eyes lowered, posture trained to take up as little space as possible. And near that door, almost inside the wall's shadow, stood Liam Carter in charcoal coveralls with a laminated badge clipped at his chest. Maintenance, night shift. The man you noticed only when something stopped working. He had been called up from his rounds 10 minutes earlier because a security supervisor had seen him in the hallway outside executive storage, his cart angled wrong, his presence inconvenient. It could have been nothing. It could have been a mistake. It could have been the smallest misunderstanding in a building fueled by paranoia and polished with fear. But Celeste's world had been tense for weeks. A leak, an anonymous message, an internal audit that felt less like due diligence and more like a hunt. When you lived at the top, every sound in the walls could be a threat or a warning. "Mr. Carter," Richard said without looking at him, voice flat with authority, "we just need to clarify why you were outside restricted Corridor B at 7:18 p.m. Liam didn't shift his weight, didn't fidget, didn't do what most people did when placed under a light, explain themselves too quickly, offer pieces of their dignity in exchange for mercy. "I was replacing a filter in the air return," he said. "Third-floor ductwork. The access stairwell to that return is Corridor B. That corridor is restricted," the legal counsel said, finally lifting her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Liam's tone carried no argument, only fact. "That's why I used my authorized maintenance key." A board member, a man with expensive glasses and a cheap smile, leaned forward. "You understand how this looks." Liam looked at him calmly. "I understand how it can be made to look." That, more than anything, stirred the room. Celeste studied him the way she studied a market before a merger, quietly, completely, without apology. She saw broad shoulders that suggested work, not a gym. Hands that had scrubbed floors and tightened bolts, the knuckles faintly scarred as if life had insisted on teaching him in rough letters, a faint bruise at the wrist, yellowing at the edges. Old enough to stop being painful, new enough to still be noticed. He wasn't tall in a way that demanded attention, but he seemed grounded, like gravity knew his name. "Where were you headed after Corridor B?" Richard pressed. "To finish my shift." "And your cart?" Jennifer asked softly, surprising everyone with her voice. Liam turned his head toward her, not dismissive, not indulgent. "I parked it near the freight elevator. Hallway's narrow. I didn't want to block it." Jennifer nodded, as if the answer aligned with something she understood about narrow hallways and how quickly small things could become accusations. Celeste felt a faint irritation at the time this was taking. Not because she didn't care. She told herself she cared about everything that kept the building safe. But because she hated inefficiency. She hated the slow rituals of suspicion that drained energy from what mattered. Still, she couldn't look away from him, because he wasn't afraid. Most people were afraid in this room. Even the board in their tailored suits held a subtle, shared fear. The fear that the world could change without their consent. The fear that control was a story, not a law. Yet Liam Carter stood there as if fear had already visited him and left its mark, and he had decided not to kneel to it again. Celeste's gaze flicked to his badge, Liam Carter, and then back to his eyes. Gray-green, steady, unsettling in their clarity. "You're very composed," she said. He didn't smile, but something softened at the edges of his expression. "It's been a long day." A few people chuckled politely. Celeste did not. Humor to her had always been a tool, useful, but dangerous when used carelessly. And for reasons she didn't understand, she suddenly felt the urge to break the room open. Not with anger, with something sharper. Richard turned slightly. Celeste, we can handle this through HR. It's procedural. Procedural. The word people use to launder cruelty into legitimacy. Celeste's fingers rested on the glass tabletop. The city reflected faintly beneath her hands, an empire of lights. She thought of the leak, the board pressure, the way her name had started showing up in business columns with that subtle tone people used when they smelled vulnerability. She had been praised for being unbreakable, and lately, she had been tired of the praise. She looked at Liam again. In his silence, something in her chest tightened, a sensation too physical to be dismissed as curiosity. It felt like standing at the edge of a ledge and realizing you could jump, not because you wanted to fall, but because you wanted to prove you could survive it. "What do you do before you come in?" she asked suddenly. Richard blinked. "Celeste." Liam answered anyway. "I pick up my daughter from after-school care." The room quieted. Celeste hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected a child to appear in the picture. Somehow, it changed the angle of everything. The badge, the cart, the coveralls. It gave the man an orbit. "How old?" she asked, and her voice, for the first time that day, did not sound like a blade. 8, Liam said. Emma. A name like a small light in a dark hallway. Celeste held his gaze. She imagined an 8-year-old girl waiting in a modest apartment, perhaps with an inhaler on the counter, perhaps with homework spread out like a small battlefield, perhaps with hope that her father would come home on time. The thought landed in her with a quiet weight she didn't enjoy. She leaned back slightly. The board watched her closely now, aware that when Celeste Hawthorne shifted, the room shifted with her. She had built a life where everyone waited for her next move, and in that moment, whether from loneliness, anger, exhaustion, or the strange hunger to feel something real, Celeste spoke again, soft but absolute. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I'm going to make you an offer." Richard's mouth tightened. Jennifer's eyes widened. The legal counsel's hands hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. Liam didn't react. He simply waited, like a man who had learned that offers often carried hooks. Celeste's smile was brief and controlled, the kind that made people nervous because it wasn't meant to comfort. "Look at me for 30 seconds, she said. "No questions, no explanations, just look." The board member with the cheap smile gave a quiet laugh. "Celeste, this is inappropriate." Celeste's eyes cut to him, and the laugh died. She turned back to Liam. "If, after those 30 seconds, she continued, you can tell me what I'm afraid of, what I'm really afraid of, I will apologize to you, in front of everyone in this room." The words landed like a match dropped into dry grass. Richard sat very still. Jennifer held her breath. The glass walls seemed to hold their own silence. Liam's eyes did not flinch. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded once, as if accepting not a dare, but a duty. "All right," he said quietly. And the room, built on power, polished by reputation, became suddenly, terrifyingly human. 30 seconds was a long time when no one was allowed to speak. Celeste Hawthorne had intended it as a test, something clean, controlled, measurable. 30 seconds of eye contact. 30 seconds to prove that whatever confidence this maintenance worker carried was an illusion, that intuition without information was just guesswork dressed up as courage. But as the seconds began to pass, she realized she had miscalculated the nature of the experiment. Liam Carter did not stare at her the way men often did, measuring, appraising, searching for leverage or weakness. He didn't look at her like a challenge, or a prize, or a threat. He looked at her the way nurses looked at patients just before delivering bad news. Not unkindly, carefully. The room seemed to recede. The glass walls blurred into reflections and light, and the city outside faded into abstraction. Celeste felt with a sudden clarity that startled her that she was being seen in a way no quarterly report had ever captured. Liam did not focus on her face alone. His gaze moved, subtly, respectfully, tracking the small betrayals of her body, the tightness at the base of her throat, the way her shoulders remained squared even at rest, as if she were bracing for impact that never came. her hands folded neatly on the table, fingers pressed together with just a little too much intention. She was still, but she was not at ease. Liam knew this posture. He had seen it in hospital rooms at 2 a.m, under fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects. He had seen it in mirrors. He had worn it himself. It was the posture of someone who could not afford to fall apart. He counted not seconds, but breaths. Celeste's breathing was shallow, controlled, disciplined. The kind learned over years of boardrooms and negotiations where weakness was currency no one could afford to spend. But beneath that control was a faint hitch, a hesitation at the end of each inhale, as if her lungs were negotiating with her will. Fear, Liam knew, was rarely loud. It lived in restraint. He thought briefly of Sarah, of the way his wife used to sit on the edge of their bed during the first weeks after the diagnosis, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, as if she were attending a meeting rather than processing the slow rearrangement of her entire future. She had smiled for doctors, asked practical questions, thanked nurses. And then, when she thought no one was watching, she would stare at the wall with eyes that seemed to be listening for something she was afraid to hear. Liam had learned then that fear didn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looked like competence. Celeste's eyes did not waver. They were sharp, intelligent, guarded. Eyes that had been praised for seeing 3 steps ahead, for predicting markets and anticipating people. Eyes that had learned early never to ask for help because help came with conditions. But there was something else there too, a loneliness so practiced it had learned to pass for strength. The room held its breath. Richard Hawthorne shifted slightly in his chair, irritation flickering across his face. This was not how investigations were supposed to proceed. There were rules, processes, liability considerations. Not this strange stillness, this silence charged with something dangerously intimate. Jennifer stood frozen near the door, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the seconds tick by on the wall clock she had never noticed before. 20 seconds. Liam felt the weight of the room pressing in, but he had learned long ago how to exist inside pressure without being crushed by it. Pressure was familiar. It was the sound of an oxygen monitor dipping at midnight, the feeling of an inhaler failing to deliver relief fast enough, the knowledge that the next decision had to be right because there might not be another one. He did not rush. He did not guess. He listened. Celeste's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There it was. Not anger, not arrogance. Grief. Unresolved, unnamed, buried beneath years of achievement. Grief for a father whose approval had come sparingly and departed permanently. Grief for a version of herself that might have existed if she had been allowed to be something other than exceptional. Grief for the intimacy she had traded, piece by piece, for control. But deeper than grief was something simpler, something more primitive, fear of abandonment, fear that the moment she faltered, truly faltered, the room would empty, that the respect she commanded would evaporate, revealing how conditional it had always been, that love, like loyalty, had terms she could not meet. 30 seconds passed. No one spoke. Celeste broke the silence first, because she could not stand it any longer. "Well?" she asked. And there it was, the faintest tremor quickly masked. "Time's up." Liam exhaled slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not look around for approval or permission. He spoke as if the room did not exist at all. "You're not afraid of losing power," he said. A ripple of discomfort moved through the board. Richard frowned. The legal counsel's pen stilled. Liam continued, his voice steady, grounded, unmistakably certain. "You're afraid that if you ever stop being strong, if you ever hesitate or fail or need someone, there will be no one left in the room." The words did not accuse. They named. Celeste felt the impact like a hand closing around her chest. For a heartbeat, the room tilted. The glass walls seemed too thin, the air too scarce. She had prepared herself for many outcomes, mockery, arrogance, a clumsy attempt at flattery. But not this, not the sudden exposure of something she had never said out loud, not even to herself. She opened her mouth to respond, to deflect, to assert control. Nothing came out. The board member with the cheap smile shifted uncomfortably. This was not entertainment anymore. This was something else, something private that had wandered into public space. Richard cleared his throat. "Celeste?" She raised a hand without looking at him. Liam stopped speaking. He did not press. He did not explain. He had learned that once truth was spoken, it did not need defending. Celeste's gaze dropped to the table, to the faint reflection of her own face in the glass. She saw, for the first time in years, not a CEO, not a symbol, not a strategy, but a woman who had built an empire to keep herself from being left behind. The silence stretched again, heavier now. Finally, Celeste stood. Her chair slid back with a soft, decisive sound. "We'll continue this later," she said, her voice controlled but altered, as if something essential had shifted beneath it. "This meeting is adjourned." No one argued. As the room emptied, Liam remained where he was, unsure whether he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He felt the familiar ache of consequence settling into his bones, the knowledge that speaking truth often came at a cost. Celeste paused at the door. She did not turn around. Not yet. Tomorrow. Celeste Hawthorne did not go home after the meeting. She told herself it was because there was work to finish. Emails to answer, damage to assess, narratives to control. That was always the excuse, the one that had served her faithfully for years. Work was the place she went when emotions threatened to complicate things. Work was clean, logical, obedient. But as the executive floor emptied and the elevators fell silent, she remained in her office long after the city lights began to blur together below. The glass no longer felt like a trophy. It felt like exposure. She stood at the window with her arms folded tightly across her chest, replaying the moment with a precision that bordered on cruelty. Every word, every breath. The exact second when Liam Carter had spoken, and something inside her had cracked without making a sound. "You're afraid that if you ever stop being strong, there will be no one left in the room." It was absurd, she told herself. Presumptuous. Amateur psychology delivered with the confidence of a man who had no idea what it took to lead an organization of this size, to carry the weight of thousands of livelihoods on her decisions. And yet, her jaw tightened. Because the sentence had not landed like an insult. It had landed like recognition. Celeste poured herself a glass of water she did not drink. Her hand trembled just enough to irritate her. She had trained herself out of tremors, out of visible uncertainty. Weakness had been edited out of her long ago, revised into something more respectable. Competence. She sat at her desk, opened a document, and stared at the blinking cursor without typing a word. Her father used to say that fear was a luxury, something indulged by people who could afford to fail. He had built the company from a cramped office and a borrowed phone line, working until his hands shook not from doubt but from exhaustion. He rewarded discipline, precision, results. When Celeste had brought home her first report card with perfect marks, he had nodded once and gone back to work. When she brought home a second-place ribbon, he had asked what went wrong. She learned quickly. Love followed performance. Respect followed outcomes. Anything else was noise. The cancer came fast. Too fast for the rituals they might have built if time had been kinder. One year he was lecturing her about margins and leverage. The next, he was pale beneath hospital sheets. His voice softened into something she did not know how to answer. "Don't let them see you hesitate," he told her near the end. "They'll take advantage." She promised she wouldn't. She kept that promise with a devotion that bordered on religion. Now, years later, she ran the company with an iron clarity that impressed analysts and unnerved competitors. She made decisive calls. She didn't waver. She didn't ask for permission, and people stayed. They stayed because they needed her, because she paid them, because she won. But the idea that they might stay if she failed, Celeste pressed her fingers into her temples. She pushed the thought away and reached for her phone instead. Habit. Control. She scrolled through messages until she found the one she wanted. "Richard. We need to talk about what happened." Of course they did. She typed back with practiced calm. "Celeste. Tomorrow morning, my office." She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be written there in recessed lighting and architectural ambition. Her pulse still hadn't fully settled. That unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Liam Carter finished his shift in silence. The building felt different after the meeting, not hostile, nothing so dramatic, but subtly altered, like a familiar room rearranged in the dark. He noticed the glances now, the way a few people paused just long enough to look at him twice. Word traveled quickly in places like this. He ignored it. He had learned to live on the margins of attention. Invisibility had been a kind of protection. Being seen, even briefly, carried risk. He cleaned methodically, muscle memory guiding his movements, as his mind replayed the meeting despite his efforts not to let it. He hadn't planned to say what he said. He hadn't rehearsed it or dressed it up. It had simply arrived. Truth had that way about it sometimes. It surfaced when silence became unbearable. As he emptied the last trash bin and pushed his cart toward the freight elevator, a familiar ache settled in his chest, not regret exactly, but the quiet anticipation of consequence. Speaking plainly to power rarely went unpunished. He had done it anyway, because something in Celeste Hawthorne's eyes had looked too familiar. He picked up his phone and checked the time. Emma would be waiting. He left the building just after midnight, the city cooler now, the air carrying the distant sound of sirens and late-night traffic. His apartment was small but clean, the kind of place that made no claims beyond shelter. Emma was asleep on the couch, a blanket tangled around her legs, a cartoon paused mid-frame on the television. The soft rise and fall of her chest eased something tight inside him. He lifted her carefully, feeling the slight wheeze at the edge of her breathing. Not an attack, just a reminder. He carried her to bed, tucked her in, and placed the inhaler within reach like a quiet prayer. Only then did he allow himself to sit on the edge of the bed and breathe. He thought of Sarah, of how she had once said, near the end, "If I go, promise me you won't disappear." He had promised that too. He stood, turned off the light, and closed the door softly behind him. Celeste slept poorly. Her dreams were fractured, boardrooms dissolving into empty halls, chairs scraping back as faces turned away. She woke before dawn with her heart racing, the sheets twisted around her like restraints. She sat up, disoriented, and stared at the darkened room. It took her a long moment to remember where she was. The fear lingered even after her breathing slowed. She dressed quickly, mechanically, choosing armor over comfort. By the time the sun rose, she was already at her desk, reviewing reports she barely absorbed. At 9 sharp, Richard arrived. He did not bother with pleasantries. "That was reckless," he said, closing the door behind him. "You invited vulnerability into a room where it doesn't belong." Celeste looked up at him, really looked, and for the first time noticed how tired he seemed, how careful, how afraid of instability. "He answered a question I asked," she said evenly. "You shouldn't have asked it." "Why?" she countered. "Because he answered honestly?" "Because honesty like that undermines authority." Celeste leaned back in her chair. "No," she said quietly. "It undermines illusion." Richard stiffened. "We cannot afford distractions right now. The board is already uneasy, and that man—" "Liam Carter," she said, correcting him without raising her voice. Richard paused. "He's a liability. He doesn't know his place." Celeste felt something sharp and unexpected rise in her chest. "Neither did I," she said. "Once." Richard studied her, searching for the woman he thought he knew. "What are you saying?" She stood. "I'm saying the problem isn't what he said," she replied. "It's that he said it out loud." Richard opened his mouth to respond. She raised a hand. "We'll continue this later," she said, echoing her own words from the night before. "I have something to do." She walked past him, her heels striking the floor with purpose, her reflection following her in the glass. For the first time in years, Celeste Hawthorne did not know exactly where she was going, only that she could not ignore what had been named, and that whatever came next would not be clean. Celeste did not summon Liam Carter. That decision, small as it seemed, mattered more than she expected. She could have asked Human Resources to clarify his role, to bring him back under the sterile light of procedure where everything could be framed, documented, diluted. She could have called security, or facilities, or any number of departments that existed to translate people into files. Instead, she waited. The morning slid into afternoon with the slow inevitability of weather. Meetings came and went. Numbers were discussed. Risks were mitigated. The machine continued to run because it always did, because it had been designed to move forward regardless of who felt what inside its walls. And beneath that motion, something in Celeste remained still. She found herself thinking not of his words, but of the way he had stood when he spoke them. Not defiant, not apologetic, rooted, as if the truth he named had weight, and he was simply holding it steady so it wouldn't tip over and spill. By 4:30, she knew she would not be able to leave the building without seeing him again. She took the service elevator down, not because it was faster, but because she did not want an audience. The elevator smelled faintly of cleaning solution and metal, a smell she associated with after hours and the invisible work that kept everything else looking effortless. The doors opened on the maintenance level, where the ceilings were lower and the lighting unforgiving. Here, nothing pretended to be grand. Pipes ran openly along the walls. Carts lined the corridor like patient animals waiting for command. Liam was at the far end, replacing a panel with slow, careful movements. He did not notice her at first. His attention was on the task, on aligning the screws so they would sit flush, on doing the work correctly even though no one would ever see the difference. Celeste stopped several feet away. She waited. It struck her then how rarely she waited for anyone. Liam looked up when the shadow shifted. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something like caution. He straightened, wiped his hands on a cloth, and nodded once. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said, not deferential, not familiar, accurate. "Liam," she replied, and surprised herself by using his name without thinking. They stood there, two people occupying different strata of the same building, neither sure who should speak first, now that the room, the glass, the board, the pressure was gone. "I didn't mean for it to become a spectacle," she said finally. He considered her words. "I know. You didn't ask permission," she added, her voice quieter now. "You didn't soften it." He met her gaze steadily. "You didn't ask for soft." No one had ever said that to her before. Celeste exhaled slowly. "I shouldn't have put you in that position." "No," he agreed. "You shouldn't have." There was no accusation in his tone, just fact. That was somehow worse and better than anger. She folded her arms, then let them drop, aware of the gesture and irritated by her own self-consciousness. "Why did you agree?" "To what?" "The challenge." Liam looked down briefly, as if checking something internal for accuracy. "Because you weren't asking to win." She frowned. "I wasn't?" "No," he said. "You were asking to be seen." The words landed without ceremony. Celeste felt the old instinct rise, to push back, to intellectualize, to regain footing by reframing the conversation into something she could manage. But the maintenance corridor offered no such leverage. There were no tables to sit at, no screens to hide behind, just exposed pipes and fluorescent light. "How do you know?" she asked. He shrugged slightly. "You didn't blink." She almost laughed. Almost. "You think not blinking means fear?" she said. "I think it means control," he replied. "And control is usually protecting something." They stood in silence again, but this time it was different, less charged, more open. "I didn't plan to say what I said," Liam continued. "It wasn't strategy. I believe you." He studied her for a moment as if deciding how much truth to offer. "I've spent a long time around people who were afraid they'd be left alone. They all look different. But the silence is the same." Celeste felt the words settle into her chest, not painfully but firmly, like something finally finding its proper place. She hesitated. That alone felt like rebellion. "You were right," she said. Liam did not respond. "I am afraid," she continued, forcing the words past a lifetime of restraint. "And not of the things people assume." He waited. "I've built this company to be indispensable," she said. "Not because I love power, but because I didn't want to find out what would happen if I ever stopped being useful." The admission echoed faintly off the concrete walls. Liam nodded once. "That makes sense. No judgment, no surprise, just understanding." Something in Celeste's throat tightened. "I owe you an apology," she said, and the words felt heavier here than they would have in the boardroom. "Not the public one, the real one, for assuming, for testing you instead of listening." He considered her for a long moment. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," she said. and I intend to keep my word." He didn't smile, but something eased in his expression, a fraction of the weight lifting. Before either of them could speak again, a sharp sound cut through the corridor. An alarm, distant but unmistakable. Not the building-wide siren. Something smaller, personal. Liam's phone vibrated in his pocket. He looked at the screen. The color drained from his face. Celeste noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. He was already moving, already reaching for his cart with hands that trembled just enough to betray him. "My daughter," he said. "Her school." Celeste's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Is she—" "I don't know yet," he replied, already dialing. "They don't call unless—" He stopped himself, took a breath, forced his voice steady as the line connected. Celeste stood there, suddenly acutely aware of how fragile control was when something truly mattered. She watched the way his shoulders tensed as he listened, the way fear reshaped his posture. Not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing with sudden clarity. This was not over. Not the conversation, not the cost, not the truth that had been named and could no longer be returned to silence. Because Celeste did not ask permission. That surprised her more than it should have. When Liam said the word school, the world narrowed to something painfully simple. There was no board, no hierarchy, no protocol that mattered more than the look on his face, the way fear moved through him not as panic but as urgency disciplined by long practice. "I'm coming with you," she said. Liam paused, phone pressed to his ear, listening to a voice only he could hear. For a split second, the instinct to refuse flickered across his features. He had learned to handle these moments alone, had learned that needing help often complicated things. But this was not the time for pride. "They're saying she's breathing," he said, voice tight, eyes unfocused. "But not well." Celeste was already walking. The service elevator doors slid open as if summoned by something older than authority. She stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, and held the doors with her hand until he followed. The descent felt too slow. Liam paced the narrow space, one hand braced against the wall, the other gripping his phone. Celeste watched him from the corner of her eye, the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders stayed squared, even as something in him strained toward breaking. "How long has this been happening?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "It's been worse the last few months. We thought we had it under control." "We," Celeste noted. "Always we." Even alone, he spoke in plural. The doors opened to the underground garage. Celeste didn't hesitate. She handed her keys to the valet stationed nearby and moved toward the nearest car with the kind of efficiency that bent people into motion around her. "Get in," she said. They drove through traffic that seemed determined to resist them, red lights stretching time into something cruel and elastic. Liam stared out the window, his leg bouncing, breath measured but shallow. Celeste made a call. "This is Celeste Hawthorne," she said, voice steady, calibrated. "I need to confirm admission status at Jefferson Elementary. Child in respiratory distress." "Yes, I'm en route." She ended the call and glanced at him. "They're stabilizing her. Ambulance is already there." He nodded once, as if accepting information into a system already overloaded. They arrived to chaos contained, teachers herding students back into classrooms, a nurse kneeling beside a small girl on a stretcher, an oxygen mask fogging faintly with each labored breath. "Emma," Liam breathed, already at her side. She turned her head slightly at the sound of his voice, eyes wide but focused, the way children look when they're trying to be brave because they don't know any other way. "I'm here, baby," he said, taking her hand. "Daddy's here." Celeste stood back, unsure of her place, watching something unbearably intimate unfold. This was not a problem that yielded to decisiveness or capital or command. This was fear stripped of metaphor. The paramedic adjusted the mask. "We're taking her in. You can ride with us." Liam nodded, his voice catching just enough to notice. "Thank you." Celeste stepped forward. "I'll follow." He looked up at her then, really looked, surprise flickering through the fear. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, and meant it. The ambulance doors closed. Sirens cut through the late afternoon air. Celeste followed in her car, her hands steady on the wheel while something unfamiliar pressed against her ribs. Helplessness. At the hospital, time became something measured in small mercies, oxygen levels rising, color returning to Emma's lips. The waiting room filled with that particular stillness born of hope, trying not to tempt fate. Celeste sat across from Liam, the plastic chairs uncomfortable, the fluorescent lights unforgiving. She had never waited like this, not without a phone buzzing, not without a schedule to fill the gaps. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly. He didn't look at her. "It's worse at night." She nodded, absorbing the weight of that sentence. The night she spent in her office suddenly felt thin, indulgent. When the doctor finally emerged, exhaustion etched into his features. Liam stood so quickly his chair tipped back. "She's stable," the doctor said. "We'll keep her overnight. I want to adjust her treatment plan." Liam exhaled a breath he'd been holding for hours. His shoulders sagged, just slightly. Celeste felt it then, the urge to do something, to write a check, to call a specialist, to deploy resources until the problem bent under the weight of her capacity. "I can help," she said, "with the doctors, the medication, whatever you need." He turned to her, eyes tired but clear. "I know you can." And then gently, "But not like that." The words weren't rejection. They were boundary. "I don't need fixing," he continued. "And Emma doesn't need to be a project." Celeste swallowed. She had walked into that sentence without realizing it. "What do you need?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "I need her to breathe, and I need to keep being her father." She nodded. "Then I'll stay out of the way." That earned her a look. Surprised, grateful, wary. They sat in silence as the sky outside the hospital darkened. When a nurse finally brought news that Emma was asleep, her breathing steady, Liam's face softened into something like relief. Celeste watched him then, really watched, and understood something that unsettled her. This man did not need saving. He had already saved someone, over and over, in ways that would never appear on any ledger she'd ever read. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated. "I meant what I said," she told him. "About the apology. I'll do it. Publicly." He looked at her, then past her, toward the corridor that led to his daughter's room. "You don't owe me that." "I owe myself the truth," she replied. He nodded once. "Then do it for that reason." She walked out into the night with the hospital lights buzzing behind her, aware that something had shifted beyond repair. Because for the first time in her life, Celeste Hawthorne had encountered a problem she could not fix. And that would change everything. The apology did not come the next morning, nor the day after. That, too, was a kind of honesty. Celeste Hawthorne spent 48 hours moving through the company like a controlled burn, focused, deliberate, leaving nothing untouched. Meetings were called, calls returned. Legal opinions requested not as shields, but as mirrors. She listened more than she spoke, which unsettled people more than anger ever had. By the end of the second day, the board understood something was coming. They just didn't know what it would cost. Richard Hawthorne stood in her office again, the city stretched behind him like a warning. "You're letting this get personal," he said. "That man crossed a line." "No," Celeste replied calmly. "He named one." "That's semantics." "No," she said again. "That's accountability." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "We are already under scrutiny. If you stand in front of the company and apologize to a maintenance worker, it will be interpreted as weakness." Celeste folded her hands on the desk. "Only by people who confuse authority with silence. You'll undermine confidence." She met his gaze. "In what? The illusion that we're infallible?" Richard straightened. "In leadership." Celeste leaned forward. "Leadership that can't survive the truth deserves to be undermined." The silence between them sharpened. "You're risking your position," he said quietly. "I know." "And for what?" he pressed. "A moment? A feeling?" "For alignment," she answered, "between who I am and what I ask others to be." Richard studied her as if searching for the woman he had helped raise, the one who used to ask what move came next and how to make it safely. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. You don't owe him this. Celeste stood. I owe the room the truth, she said, and I owe myself the courage not to hide from it. Richard looked away. That was how she knew the conversation was over. Liam Carter returned to work 3 days later. He had considered not coming back. The hospital discharge papers were still folded in his jacket pocket. Emma's new medication schedule written in careful block letters he checked every few hours like a ritual. He was tired in a way sleep didn't touch, but he had learned that stability mattered, routine mattered. The building, with all its glass and indifference, still paid the bills, still kept the lights on at home. So he clocked in. The looks came immediately. Some curious, some impressed, some wary, a few openly hostile. He ignored them. He always had. But halfway through his shift, his supervisor stopped him near the supply closet. HR wants to see you, she said. Not unkindly, not apologetically, just factual. Liam nodded. He had expected this. The HR office smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the walls lined with framed mission statements that promised integrity in fonts chosen by consultants. The representative across from him, a woman with precise posture and tired eyes, gestured for him to sit. This is procedural, she began, but we need to document the incident. Liam waited. There have been concerns raised about appropriateness, she continued carefully. About boundaries, about your interaction with the CEO. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct to defend, to explain, to justify his presence in rooms not built for him. He didn't indulge it. I answered a question, he said. Yes, she agreed, but some feel you should have declined. I wasn't asked to perform, he replied. I was asked to speak. She hesitated. Be that as it may, there's sensitivity. Liam nodded once. I understand. She studied him. Do you? Yes, he said. I understand that telling the truth to power makes people nervous. Her pen paused mid-note. There was a knock at the door. Neither of them spoke as it opened. Celeste Hawthorne stepped inside. The HR representative stood immediately. Ms. Hawthorne, you can give us the room, Celeste said. Not cold, not harsh, certain. The woman hesitated only a moment before nodding and slipping out, closing the door behind her with a click that sounded far louder than it should have. Liam remained seated. So did Celeste. For a few seconds, neither spoke. I wanted you to hear it from me, Celeste said finally. There will be consequences. He nodded. I assumed as much. For me, she clarified. That made him look up. I'm calling a company-wide meeting, she continued. Today, I'm going to apologize. He watched her carefully now, measuring not the words but the cost behind them. You don't have to do that, he said. I do, she replied. Not for you, for the culture that made this room possible. He considered her, then spoke quietly. They'll come for you. Yes, she said simply. He stood then, slow and deliberate. I don't want to be the reason. You're not, she cut in. You're the mirror. I'm the one choosing to look. They held each other's gaze, something unspoken passing between them, an understanding that what followed could not be undone. Emma's breathing better, he said unexpectedly. Celeste felt a warmth spread through her chest. I'm glad. He nodded once, then moved toward the door. Liam, she said. He turned. Thank you, she added, for not saying it gently. A flicker of something crossed his face, not pride, not relief. Recognition. The auditorium filled quickly. Employees from every floor took seats beside one another, whispers threading through the space like low static. Phones were silenced, doors closed. The air thickened with anticipation. Celeste stood alone on the stage. No podium, no script, just a microphone and the truth she had been avoiding her entire life. She scanned the room once, found Liam near the back, standing rather than sitting, his presence quiet but undeniable. She inhaled. When I asked a question earlier this week, she began. I didn't expect an answer. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I expected compliance, or deflection, or silence. She paused. What I received instead was honesty. The room stilled. I want to apologize, Celeste continued, her voice steady, though something inside her trembled. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I assumed authority entitled me to test someone's dignity. She turned slightly, addressing the space Liam occupied without naming him. I was wrong. The words landed heavily, cleanly. A CEO admitting fault, publicly, deliberately. This company will not punish truth-telling, she said, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it is. She lowered the microphone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was listening. And somewhere in the back of the room, Liam Carter felt the quiet certainty of something ending, so that something else could begin. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. Emails with careful language, calendar invites labeled urgent, calls that rang too long before connecting. Celeste Hawthorne moved through the next days with a calm that surprised even her. The apology had not shattered her authority the way Richard had warned. If anything, it had exposed fault lines that had already been there, now visible to anyone willing to look. Some people leaned closer, others stepped back. Both reactions told the truth. She watched it happen without flinching. She had learned, finally, that leadership was not about controlling outcomes, but about choosing which truths you were willing to carry. Liam Carter kept his distance. That was deliberate. He understood momentum, how easily a story could turn a man into a symbol and then crush him beneath its weight. He did not want to be anyone's proof. He wanted to finish his shift, pick up his daughter, make dinner, and keep the night from turning into an emergency. For a week, that was enough. Then Thursday came. The call reached him just after midnight, when the building had settled into its lowest hum and the lights had learned how to be patient. Emma's name lit the screen like a flare. He answered before the second ring. "Daddy," she said, breathless, trying to keep it together the way she always did. "It's hard again." He was already moving. He reached the apartment in 10 minutes flat, keys shaking in his hand despite his effort to steady them. Emma sat upright on the couch, inhaler clenched between her fingers, eyes too wide, lips pale. The wheeze was back, thin, sharp, insistent. "Okay," he said softly, kneeling in front of her. "We've got this." They didn't. Not this time. The inhaler barely touched it. The spacer rattled uselessly. He could feel the familiar panic pressing in. The old terror that knew exactly how to hollow him out. He counted breaths the way he always did, anchoring himself so she wouldn't feel the fear he refused to give her. When he called for an ambulance, his voice was calm, his hands were not. The hospital lights washed everything the same color, urgency without texture. Emma was whisked away with practiced speed, oxygen hissing, monitors chirping their nervous reassurance. Liam followed until he was gently, firmly stopped. "Please wait here," the nurse said. He did. Waiting had become a skill. Minutes passed, then hours. The chairs were too small, the clock too loud. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't read. He sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor, willing the world to cooperate. It did not. At 2:30 in the morning, Celeste Hawthorne walked into the pediatric wing. She wore no jacket, no makeup, no armor beyond presence. Her hair was loose, her eyes shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from staying when leaving would have been easier. Liam looked up, startled. "You shouldn't," he began. She held up a hand. "I know." She sat beside him without asking. They waited together. The doctor arrived with careful words and practiced restraint. Emma was stable, he said, but the pattern was concerning. The episodes were escalating. The current treatment plan was no longer enough. "We need to talk about next steps," the doctor said. Celeste listened without interrupting. She watched Liam's face as the information landed, the way hope recalibrated into resolve, the way fear took on a different shape when it became long-term. After the doctor left, the silence between them felt heavier than before. "I don't want you to fix this," Liam said quietly, without looking at her. "I don't want favors or strings or leverage." Celeste nodded. "I know." She took a breath. "I don't want to fix it either." He turned to her then, surprised. "I want to stand here," she continued, "and not disappear, even if there's nothing to do." Something in his chest loosened at that. They sat until dawn crept into the edges of the room and the machines softened their beeping. Emma slept, finally, her breathing steady enough to allow the room to exhale. When the nurse said visiting hours were ending, Celeste stood. "I'll be back," she said. Not a promise, a statement. He nodded once. "Okay." She left without fanfare. The board meeting that morning was brief and sharp. Richard spoke first. Others followed. Words like liability and precedent were placed carefully on the table, as if they were neutral objects rather than loaded judgments. The subtext was clear. Celeste's apology had cracked a door some people did not want open. "We need to protect the company," Richard said. Celeste met his gaze. "We need to protect the people." Silence answered her. "Effective immediately," she continued. "We are establishing a support framework for employees with dependent care emergencies, flexible scheduling, medical advocacy, mental health coverage that doesn't punish disclosure." A board member scoffed. "This isn't charity." "No," Celeste said. "It's infrastructure." Another voice chimed in, cautious. "And the optics?" Celeste leaned forward. "If caring for the people who keep this company running looks bad, then our optics were already broken." The vote passed, narrowly. That afternoon, HR sent out the memo. It traveled fast, not because of its language, but because of what it acknowledged, that lives existed beyond the building and they mattered. Liam read it on his phone while sitting beside Emma's bed. He didn't smile. He closed his eyes. They didn't speak about it the next time they met. They didn't need to. Weeks passed. Emma's treatment adjusted. The nights remained uncertain, but the ground beneath them felt less brittle. Celeste stopped working past midnight. Liam stopped expecting the worst as his default setting. They learned each other in small increments, coffee at odd hours, shared silences that didn't demand filling, conversations that drifted without agenda. One evening, as Emma slept and the city glowed beyond the window, Celeste said something she had never said aloud before. "I don't know who I am when I'm not in charge." Liam didn't answer right away. "That's not a failure," he said eventually. "It's a beginning." She absorbed that quietly. Outside, the night held steady, neither threatening nor kind, just present. And for the first time, Celeste Hawthorne did not feel the need to conquer it. The letter arrived on a Monday, not an email, not a call filtered through legal counsel or softened by an assistant's voice. A letter, heavy paper, precise margins, language chosen to sound inevitable. Celeste Hawthorne read it once without reaction, then again more slowly, then a third time, because she wanted to be certain she was not imagining the clarity with which the board had finally drawn its line. "We believe it is in the company's best interest for you to consider transitioning into an advisory role." Advisory. The word tasted like exile dressed as respect. She folded the letter carefully and set it on her desk, next to a framed photo she rarely noticed anymore. Her father, younger than she remembered him, standing beside the original office sign with his sleeves rolled up and his expression already calculating the next risk. She did not feel angry. That surprised her most. What she felt instead was a quiet grief, not for the title, but for the years she had spent believing that proximity to power was the same thing as belonging. She left the office early that day. No announcement. No spectacle. Just a quiet exit that unsettled the staff more than any dramatic resignation would have. The elevators hummed, the city moved. The world, it seemed, did not wait for her to decide who she was. She drove without destination until the buildings thinned and the streets learned how to breathe. When she finally parked, it was outside the hospital. She found Liam in the cafeteria, stirring coffee he hadn't touched, his attention fixed somewhere far beyond the window. He looked up when she approached. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she replied, sitting across from him. They shared the coffee in silence, the kind that had become familiar, no longer charged, no longer cautious, just space. "They want me to step aside," she said eventually. He did not pretend surprise. "Are you going to?" She considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she said. "Part of me wants to fight, to prove that I'm still necessary." "And the other part?" "The other part is tired," she admitted. "And curious." He nodded. "About what?" "About who I might be if I'm not constantly defending my position." He smiled faintly. "That's a dangerous curiosity." "I know." They sat with that. Later that afternoon, Celeste attended the board session she had been asked to skip. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not list accomplishments or remind them how many crises she had navigated while others watched safely from a distance. She said only this: "I understand your concern, but if the cost of leadership is silencing truth, then this role no longer fits me." The room went still. Richard stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're walking away?" "No," Celeste replied calmly. "I'm stepping toward something else." She signed the transition agreement with a steady hand. When she stood, no one clapped. No one stopped her. That, too, was honesty. Liam learned about the change the way most people did, through a quiet ripple of conversation that moved faster than official statements. He read the internal memo twice, then a third time, searching for hidden meaning. He found none. He saw her that evening, standing outside the pediatric wing, her posture unguarded in a way that still startled him. "It's done," she said. He studied her face, looking for regret. He found relief, uncertainty, something like peace. "Are you okay?" he asked. She considered the question, then answered carefully. "I don't know yet, but I think I will be." Emma waved from her bed when she saw Celeste, her smile bright and unburdened by adult interpretation. "Did you quit?" Emma asked, blunt as only children could be. Celeste laughed, a real laugh, surprised into existence. "Something like that." "Good," Emma said. "Daddy says quitting is okay if you're quitting the wrong thing." Liam shot his daughter a look. "I did not say it like that." "You did," Emma insisted. Celeste felt something loosen in her chest. Later, as Emma slept and the machines hummed their patient vigilance, Celeste spoke again, softer now. "I don't want to disappear," she said, "but I don't want to be in charge of everything anymore." "You don't have to be," Liam replied. "You can just be here." She nodded. That night, when she left the hospital, she did not return to her penthouse. She went instead to a small rented house on a quiet street, one she had bought months earlier and never moved into because it didn't fit the story she was telling about her life. She unlocked the door and stood in the empty living room, listening to the echo of her own footsteps. It was not grand, it was not impressive. It was enough. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and let the silence settle without trying to fill it. For the first time, she did not feel watched. She did not feel tested. She felt, tentatively, free. And in that quiet, uncelebrated moment, something in her shifted permanently toward what came next. Change did not announce itself. It arrived the way breath does, quietly, insistently, unnoticed until it was no longer there. Celeste Hawthorne woke in the small house to the sound of morning without obligation. No alerts, no pre-written agenda, no calendar dictating the angle of her day. The absence was disorienting. She made coffee she did not rush through. She sat at the table and let the light move across the wall without interpreting it as time wasted. The city still existed somewhere beyond the window, but it no longer owned her hours. By mid-morning, her phone rang. It was not a board member. It was Jennifer. "I'm sorry to bother you," her former assistant said, voice careful, still carrying the habits of hierarchy. "But people are asking what happens now." Celeste smiled faintly. "People always ask that. They want to know if the support framework stays." Celeste's smile faded, replaced by something steadier. "It does." Jennifer hesitated. "Even without you in charge?" "Especially without me in charge," Celeste replied. "That's the point." A pause. "Thank you," Jennifer said quietly, not as an employee, as a person. When the call ended, Celeste felt the weight of a truth settle fully into place. Systems outlived individuals. That was their danger, and their promise. If she had done this correctly, the change would continue without her name attached to it. She wanted that more than she wanted credit. At the hospital, Liam read the updated policy memo with cautious disbelief. It wasn't flashy. No grand declarations, just paragraphs written in clear language, outlining procedures for medical advocacy, dependent care emergencies, and mental health leave without penalty or stigma. Infrastructure, Celeste had called it. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, not because he needed it there, but because holding proof mattered when you'd lived too long without it. Emma was coloring at the small table by the window, her breathing steady, her focus intense in the way children brought to simple joys. She glanced up. "Is that from your work?" she asked. "Yes," Liam said. "Are they being nicer now?" He smiled. "They're learning." Emma considered this. "Learning takes a long time," he nodded. "Sometimes." That afternoon, Celeste joined them, carrying nothing but herself. No bag, no agenda. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed and listened to an elaborate story about a dragon who learned to sleep instead of fight. "It sounds wise," Celeste said. "It was tired," Emma corrected. "Being scary all the time is exhausting." Celeste felt the truth of that settle somewhere deep. Later, when Emma slept, Liam and Celeste stood by the window, watching the city soften into evening. "They're calling it a culture shift," Liam said. Celeste hummed. "They always need a phrase. They're also saying it sets a precedent." She met his gaze. "Everything humane does." He studied her, searching for regret again. He found none. "Are you going to miss it?" he asked. She thought of the glass tower, the applause that never quite reached her, the armor she had mistaken for identity. "I'll miss the certainty," she said, "not the cost." The weeks that followed proved her right. The system resisted at first, as systems always did. Middle managers questioned. Shareholders asked pointed questions on earnings calls. Articles appeared, some praising courage, others warning of softness. Celeste did not respond to any of them. She spent her days differently now. She met with advocacy groups, consulted quietly with teams building the new framework. She sat in rooms without leading them, spoke when asked, and listened when not. It was harder than ruling. It was also more honest. At the company, something subtle began to shift. Employees stopped whispering in hallways. Requests were made without fear. A father took time off without apology. A mother disclosed anxiety without consequence. Small acts accumulated into something sturdier than policy: trust. Liam felt it first in the smallest way. His supervisor asking, not telling, when his schedule changed. HR calling to check in, not investigate. Coworkers offering help without spectacle. He did not mistake this for gratitude. He recognized it for what it was: dignity, returning to a place that had forgotten how to make room for it. One evening, Celeste joined him on a park bench while Emma played nearby, her laughter cutting cleanly through the air. "I've been asked to stay on as an advisor," Celeste said. He waited. "Part-time, no authority, no veto power." "And?" She watched Emma run. "I said yes." "Why?" "So I can help without controlling," she said. "So the system doesn't swing back when I'm not looking." He nodded. "That sounds right." They sat in silence, the kind that no longer carried weight, just presence. "You know," Celeste said, almost to herself, "I spent years believing strength meant never needing anyone. And now? And now I think strength might be choosing to stay when you don't have to." He glanced at her. Something warm and careful in his expression. "That's a different kind of courage," she smiled. Across the park, Emma waved, demanding attention, demanding witnesses to a small, triumphant jump. They waved back, equally serious about the task. The world did not end. The company did not collapse. The system adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably, learning that it could expand without breaking. And Celeste Hawthorne, once certain that leadership required armor, discovered that the most lasting change did not come from standing above, but from standing alongside, until Celeste Hawthorne learned the true shape of loss on a Wednesday afternoon. Not the sharp kind that announces itself with sirens or signatures, but the quieter absence that settles when something you built no longer needs you. Her calendar was suddenly sparse. Her phone rang less. The world did not collapse in response to her reduced visibility, and that realization carried a strange, humbling relief. She spent the morning walking, not for exercise, not to think, just to move without purpose, to let the city present itself without demanding anything in return. Storefronts opened, buses exhaled at corners. People carried their lives in small bags and unfinished conversations. No one recognized her, no one deferred. It was the most honest mirror she had encountered. By noon, she sat in a modest cafe and read the internal report Jennifer had sent, an update on the new support framework. The language was procedural, careful, unmistakably institutional. Yet threaded through the paragraphs were decisions that could not be rolled back easily. Dedicated advocates for medical emergencies, protected leave without retaliation, manager training focused not on productivity alone, but on human continuity. Celeste closed the document and felt a subtle, steady satisfaction. This would outlive her. That had been the point. At the hospital, Liam watched Emma build a city out of plastic blocks. She named streets after animals and declared one corner a park where everyone has to breathe slowly. He smiled and pretended not to notice the metaphor. A nurse stopped by to check vitals and lingered just long enough to ask, "Is work treating you better?" "Yes," Liam said. He did not embellish. He did not apologize for the truth. "Good," the nurse replied. "It should." Later he read the policy update again, slower this time. He noticed what had not been included. No grand announcement, no press release tied to a single name. The system was learning to speak in plural. That mattered. When Celeste arrived that afternoon, she carried groceries instead of flowers, soup, fruit, bread still warm from the bakery. She set them down as if they belonged there. "How's today?" she asked. "Quieter," Liam said, "which is a gift." They watched Emma arrange her city with intense concentration. When she finished, she stepped back and nodded, satisfied. "It works," she said. Celeste crouched beside her. "Why?" "Because there are paths," Emma answered. "If one street is blocked, you can go another way." Celeste felt the words land with unexpected weight. The board meeting that week proceeded without her. That, too, was intentional. Richard called afterward, his voice measured. "They're uneasy," he said, "but the numbers are holding. Morale indicators are improving." Celeste smiled to herself. "Then let them be uneasy." "You're certain you don't want to return?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I want to remain responsible," she said. "Not central." Richard was quiet. When he spoke again, his tone had softened. "Your father would have fought harder." Celeste did not bristle. "My father fought the battles of his time," she said. "This is ours." When the call ended, she felt the last thread of obligation loosen. Not severed, released. Weeks passed. The system resisted in predictable ways. Some managers complied in name only. Some employees tested the boundaries. A few critics sharpened their warnings. None of it surprised Celeste. Change that mattered never arrived cleanly. She stayed anyway. As an advisor, she asked questions rather than issuing directives. She pressed for clarity, not control. She learned to let discomfort teach instead of punish. The work was slower. The results were less theatrical. They were real. Liam noticed the difference in the smallest details. A supervisor who asked how Emma was doing and waited for the answer. A schedule adjusted without explanation required. A quiet email that said, "Take the time you need. We'll cover the rest." Dignity, restored in increments. One evening, as they sat on a bench while Emma played nearby, Liam said, "You know this could be undone." Celeste nodded. "Everything can. Then why stay?" "So it's harder to undo," she replied, "and so people know what to look for if it's taken away." He considered that. "That's a long game." She smiled. "I finally learned how to play one." They sat with the dusk as it gathered, neither rushing the moment. The city hummed its usual argument with itself. Somewhere, a train sounded. Somewhere else, a child laughed. Emma ran over, breathless. "Watch this!" They watched. They clapped. They bore witness to a small triumph that required no authority to validate it. Celeste felt the truth settle, complete and unadorned. Power did not have to disappear to make room for people. It only had to step back far enough to let them breathe. And in that space, new, fragile, alive, the system began to learn what it meant to hold without squeezing until the question arrived without ceremony. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to make Celeste restless because it did not demand performance. Sunlight lay across the small backyard in loose patterns, filtered through the leaves of the tree she and Liam had planted together in early spring. Emma sat cross-legged on the grass, arranging stones into careful rows, narrating a story only she fully understood. Celeste watched her for a while before speaking. "If I'm afraid now," she said quietly, "will you still stay?" The words surprised her by how gently they landed. There was no challenge in them, no test, no audience, just the truth, offered without armor. Liam didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair, feeling the familiar weight of the moment. Not heavy, not sharp, just real. He had learned, over years of watching breath come and go, that some questions deserve time before response. "Yes," he said at last. "If you let yourself be human." Celeste nodded. That was the condition she could finally accept. Emma looked up from her stones. "Are you talking about the big room again?" she asked. Celeste smiled. "What big room?" "The one where people leave if you don't do it right," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Daddy said it's not real." Liam blinked. "I didn't say it like that." "You did," Emma insisted, unbothered by adult revision. "You said some rooms are only rooms if you keep them scared." Celeste felt something warm and almost painful spread through her chest. Emma returned to her stones, satisfied, and the adults shared a look that needed no explanation. The room had been real, but it had never been permanent. Celeste's role as advisor settled into something unremarkable and sturdy. She attended fewer meetings, asked better questions. When she spoke, people listened, not because they had to, but because she no longer needed them to. The framework she helped design continued to evolve. Imperfectly, slowly, but it endured. Employees used it without apology. Managers learned, sometimes reluctantly, that compassion did not erode performance, it clarified it. A system that could breathe discovered it did not have to tighten its grip to survive. Liam remained where he was. That surprised people. He declined promotions that came with prestige and visibility, but no flexibility. He accepted adjustments that allowed him to leave when Emma needed him and stay when the work mattered. He became known not as a story, not as a symbol, but as someone reliable in the quietest sense of the word. Emma's health improved in uneven increments, 2 steps forward, 1 back, then forward again. The crises grew less frequent, the nights less sharp. Hope stopped feeling like a risk and began to resemble a plan. They built a life that did not look impressive from a distance, it looked honest up close. One afternoon, months later, Celeste stood once more in the glass conference room on the 42nd floor, not for a meeting, for closure. The city stretched below her, still loud, still ambitious, still convinced of its own urgency. She rested her hands on the table where she had once demanded certainty and received truth instead. She remembered the fear that had lived here, the fear of being left behind, of being unnecessary, of stepping out of line and watching the room empty. She smiled softly. The room had emptied, and she had not disappeared. She left the building without looking back. That evening, they sat together on the porch as the light faded. Emma leaned against Celeste's side, half asleep, her breathing slow and even. Liam watched them with the calm gratitude of a man who had learned not to ask the future for guarantees. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. Celeste considered the question honestly. "I miss who I thought I had to be," she said. "Not who I was." He nodded. "That's a clean break." "Not clean," she corrected gently. "Just true." They sat with that. A breeze moved through the yard. The tree leaves whispered their small, persistent applause. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor laughed. Somewhere farther away, a siren passed and faded. The world continued, indifferent and alive. Emma stirred. "Are we winning?" she murmured, eyes still closed. Celeste smiled. "What do you think?" Emma smiled too, barely awake. "I think nobody lost." Liam reached across the small table and took Celeste's hand. The calluses on his palm met the softness of hers, neither trying to change the other. "That sounds right," he said. They stayed there as night settled, not guarding anything, not waiting for permission, not bracing for departure. The room did not empty. No one left. And for the first time, Celeste Hawthorne understood that belonging was not something you secured by strength or strategy. It was something you practiced, always.